Commissioner, how are you this morning?
I'm great. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning. Good morning. Do you have an off season?
Not much anymore because the season ended and the draft was last week. Obviously, the award show is tonight. The summer league free agency starts July 1st. Then we go into the summer league. We've got a WNBA. So it's great to be busy, but not much of an off season.
But is everybody trying to look at the blueprint of the NFL? Not that you can be the NFL in popularity, but that they stretch it out for a good 11 months. You want to have you want to be part of the conversation even in the off season. Is that your goal?
We didn't set out that way. It's more a function of the calendar. And we've talked about, frankly, moving the draft even later in the year, because if we had a longer finals in the years where we end up with 7 games, it's such a mad rush into the draft, which comes only a few days after Game 7. So ideally, we would have moved it later, but when we consulted with our teams, because if we push the draft later, it would push free agency back later. It would push our summer league back later. Plus, on top of that, there's things that we don't have control over, like summer competitions, whether they be World Cup games in basketball, Olympic summers. So it's actually not our intention. We'd like to give people more of a rest, both league office people working around the year and players as well. But again, it's more a function of the calendar.
If you had an MVP vote, who would you vote for this season?
I'm not responding.
Why? Wait. You watch the game. You love the game. Why can't you have an opinion on that?
I have an opinion, but I love them all. And I honestly have my own view, but don't think it would be appropriate for me to answer. But I love all three finalists are fantastic players.
It's not like you love your kids all the same, because I have 4 kids. I don't love them all the same, Commissioner. I'll tell you who I would give my MVP to in my family. So this is your family.
Here's the problem. I only have one daughter, Louise, and it's complete love. So I don't know how to make those kind of decisions that you folks with 4 kids do.
So she's your LeBron, is what you're saying.
And my Kawhi, and my Harden, and my Westbrook.
Of course,
Yeah.
Of course. Okay, I got a couple of things here. This is what I want to understand. With the designation with the All-NBA team, we still have a center, 2 forwards, and 2 guards. But I look at these centers, they're not among the top 15 players in the NBA. But there's things attached to this with Gordon Hayward and Paul George who are better than DeAndre Jordan or Rudy Gobert. They don't make the All-NBA team. Why do we have a center designation when we've almost prided ourselves in the fact that nobody really has positions anymore?
It's a very fair question, and because, as you know, we eliminated the center designation for All-Star balloting, and so there is an inconsistency with All-NBA. And the reason we left it for All-NBA, it was more a function of contracts that had already been negotiated, where there are bonuses and incentives set for winning awards based on being the center and and an All-NBA All-NBA consideration that comes from being a center. I think it's one of the things we should consider changing if we were going to do it, though. I think just as a function of contracts that were already entered into, we have to announce it and then change it 2 or 3 seasons later. But you're right, and it's not, and it's a little different with All-Star because it's an exhibition game, so there weren't all the same incentives tied to specific positions for All-Star. But I don't have a better reason than that. It was based entirely on the fact that contracts had been written and there were incentives based on being the designation that came from being center.
Yeah, just grandfather it in, but I think as you move forward, because, Gordon Hayward could leave Utah because of this. Paul George could leave Indiana, it looks like, because of that they're not going to get their max deals. Also wanted to ask you, you can write what you think is the ideal rule for the one and done, 2 and done coming out of high school. If I gave you that autonomy, how would you do it that you think is the right way to go with how we have these kids coming into college or coming into the NBA?
Yeah, and another very fair question. So if you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have said if I didn't have to negotiate this with the union, I would raise the minimum age to 20 from 19. And of course, it was in 2004 18, and we collectively bargained with the union, raise it to 19, but they've historically opposed going to 20. My view has changed, and I don't have a great answer, but the reason my view has changed is, for example, I've talked about this before. If you look at that Ben Simmons documentary about what his year was like in school at LSU, and no knock on LSU, but he's a bright young man. He was saying, I'm only here because I'm being forced to defer going to the NBA for a year, and NCAA tournament didn't seem all that important to him, and it may ultimately have been a lost year in his development because he's not fully engaged in school, he's not fully engaged in basketball, in part because of very understandable NCAA regulations on how often coaches can interact with their teams, limitations in the summer, et cetera. And then I look at some of the players coming in internationally who are becoming full-time professional basketball players, as we see in global soccer at 16 years old, and they're on in some cases, a better development program, and also a more holistic one, even in terms of injury prevention and better monitoring of everything they're doing and better control over them. So where does that leave me? To me, it's no longer an issue of whether we go from 19 to 18 or 19 to 20. I think it means that we as the NBA have to do something we've historically avoided, which is getting more involved in youth basketball. And if you sit with the folks from Nike or Under Armour or Adidas, they can tell you who the top 100 14-year-olds are in the world. And there's a fairly close correlation between the top 100 at 14 and the top 100 at 18.
But is it back on the table, though, that kids are going to be able to come out of high school right to the NBA? Is that a possible option here?
It's a possible option. It's on the table. I would add into the mix, though, what is our development league, now known as the G League, going forward. I think that creates an opportunity as well, and maybe that becomes an alternative. Right now, you can go into our development league at 18. We don't talk about that a lot because I think for most of the top young men, college, even if all you care about is basketball and you're not focused on your education, college still seems to be a better alternative for them in getting the exposure and getting the development in these great programs. And by the way, I don't mean to diminish in any way their need for education, but just being a realist here, that they're not even, a lot of them aren't even spending a full 1 year in college, and their entire focus is becoming an NBA player. So that question becomes, if we allow players to get drafted at 18, do they go first into our G League? Do some portion of the players go directly into our G League? That's why I'm just being honest, I don't have a secret plan in the drawer. I think but my thinking has evolved on this subject, and I think it's something that even before we sit back down with the union, you're right, the fair question from the union could be, what is it that you want? Before we even start negotiating. And right now, we have our competition committee focused on it. We have an owners meeting in July. We're looking at a lot of the data in terms of sort of injuries. I'm hearing from team orthopedics now who've been around the league for a long time. They're seeing wear and tear injuries among 19 and 20-year-olds that they used to see among 28 and 29-year-olds. And I think that's also a function, in part, not all AAU is bad, but in many cases, these young men are playing, or teenagers are playing far too many games, where I've said it before, there's a pitch count in Little League, but in basketball, you often have kids playing 8 games in a weekend, and there's no incentive to raise their hand and say, my knee's swollen or sore or my ankle hurts, because every game seemingly is important in terms of college scouting.
We're talking to the commissioner of the NBA, Adam Silver, big awards ceremony coming up tonight. The concerns over tanking, I love that the Sixers say trust the process. Boy, that really dresses it up when all you're doing is just trying to lose games. Right. Mark Cuban came on my show recently and said, look, once we were out of it, we were tanking to see if we could get in a better position for the lottery. How do we prevent tanking?
First, I think Mark was being provocative, and I've talked to him about it since then. I mean, if you look at his record over the end of the season, I think there's a big difference. As you and I maybe would use the word tanking, which is teams intentionally losing, as opposed to putting young players out there, players you need to make decisions about and deciding whether there's guys you want to renew, whether there's guys you want to trade, et cetera. So, I just putting Mark Cuban's comment aside for a second, I think where he was being provocative was something he's said to me before, which is this is an area the league needs to take a fresh look at because, we put the lottery in place precisely for this reason, and that was well over 30 years ago because teams seemingly had this huge incentive to finish at the bottom because the value of these draft picks is so high. And we've tinkered with the draft lottery, I think, almost 5 times, in the last 30-plus years. But we're still not at the point where it's frankly working. And I recognize it's always going to be a balance as long as draft picks, especially top draft picks, are so strategically important for teams. They're going to have an incentive in certain cases to be at the bottom. But I think I've looked at a bunch of different proposals, everything from we should lock in from when a team record in March, and that should be the order of the draft. People have suggested, just flat out changing the odds. Changing the, making the curve flatter.
What
so
if you can only be in
a
certain number of years? Like Philadelphia could be in back-to-back years. You can't be in 3 years in a row.
That's the problem is if a team is frankly genuinely bad, I mean, the purpose of the draft, of course, is to help them rebuild and to help improve them. And so you end up in a situation where a team, maybe through no fault of their own, they're not part of any process, but they've been unlucky. They've had injuries. Players haven't panned out, and the question is, what is the purpose of the draft? And if you're saying we're gonna just create some bright line rule that you can't be in the lottery 3 years in a row or whatever it is, is that team going to be sort of locked into being bad? But that's just a quick reaction to it. I think that's something we have to look at as well. I would just say right now it's not working. And I mean, you look at European soccer, the other end of the spectrum,
relegation.
I mean, it is a problem, in this league when there's a bit of a free rider issue too, because in all the major leagues in the United States, each team gets an equal share of the national television money, whether or not you're the champion or you finish 30th in terms of the standings. And so also financially, there's not a great incentive. And when some of our owners also own clubs in the Premier League, for example, I mean, relegation, it completely changes the financial framework of your team, sets you back, maybe for a decade in some cases. So
what about if you did this, though,
huge incentive.
What if you said, once you're eliminated from the playoffs, then the clock starts ticking, that the best record then gets the most ping pong balls out of the teams that have been eliminated. Therefore, the rest of the season, you're going to compete as hard as you can, and there's a reward at the end of the rainbow for being a bad team that is just not played that well.
It's an interesting idea, and I think it's one we should look at, too. I mean, some people have said, well, then what's the incentive for those players? They're playing incredibly hard so that a team, the better their performance is, the more likely they may get replaced by a draft pick. But there's a lot of smart people in this league, and a lot of smart commentators like you who have got some great ideas. And I mean it. And they come in through social media. I get lots of them come directly into my email, my inbox. So I know there's a problem now. I think this is why Mark said what he said on your show, and it's something that, again, we've experimented with so many different approaches over the years. It's why we have the lottery, but we're not in a great place when teams seemingly don't have an incentive to win at the end of the season, or even to run on a process for an entire season, as we've seen.
Have I said anything on this show that you actually got angry about, that got to your desk that you're angry about?
Not at all. Why? Am I acting angry?
No. Stern would, but Stern would act that way no matter what. No, Adam, you're fine. It's David would always let me know if I did something wrong.
It's the name Stern.
I know, like he just lives up to it. He has to be that way. Can you help the Knicks, Adam? Can you do anything?
No.
You cannot help. They cannot be helped, is what you're saying. The commissioner is saying.
I'm only saying in my role as commissioner.
Oh, okay.
It's not for me to get involved in the management of the Knicks.
Okay, but you're not saying they can't be helped.
When I walk the streets of New York, it's probably the number one thing that fans say to me, but I think Jim Dolan wrote a song called Fix the Knicks, so he's aware of that as well.
Have fun tonight, and good luck with your private MVP vote of Russell Westbrook.
Thanks, Dan. Great talking to you.
Okay, Commissioner. That's Commissioner Adam Silver right there.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.